All great storytellers understand how to use perspective to their advantage. Think about this example, for instance. There's a man standing at the center of a stadium, and he reaches his hand out to shake another man's hand who's standing in front of him. Now, the man standing in front of the initial person can see only the handshake and the smile on his face. However, everybody in the audience who's sitting and watching this exchange can see that the first man is holding a knife behind his back. This is a manipulation of perspective. The storyteller can tell the story that they want to tell with the characters and the angles that they choose to provide. The audience can see only what's displayed by the storyteller, or the filmmaker, or the wordsmith, no matter what form of media it is that we're listening to or watching. The two main pillars of perspective that I'm going to be talking about today are, first, prejudice, and second, framing. Let's discuss that first one for a moment, because when you hear the word prejudice, there's something that you're thinking of, and it might not be the exact definition that I'm using today. Let's just put the definition on screen for a second. All right, so the definition of prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So this seems pretty cut and dry, but I'm going to argue for a more expansive definition of this word, and here's how I'm going to do it. It says based not on reason or actual experience, right? Well, let's say, for instance, because we're going to use a lot of dog examples today, let's use dogs, for instance, okay? Let's say a person has at some point in time been bitten by a dog, right? Every time they see a dog from that point into the future, they might be very afraid. They might assume that that dog is going to bite them. Now, would this be considered a prejudice, or would this be considered a reasonable reaction based off experience? Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, for those of us who love dogs, you know that most dogs, especially with good owners, aren't going to bite you. So to have a physical reaction and to hide from dogs and to never interact with a dog for the rest of your life because one bit you, well, even though that might be a decision based off of reason, it's still definitely a prejudice because it's not an accurate account of most or all dogs. One of the uncomfortable truths about human beings is that we all have prejudices, some that we know about and some that maybe we don't. Now, when you think of certain prejudice, such as racism, well, as a society, it's easy for us to look and say, we've decided this is a really bad thing, and it's not cool to be that kind of prejudice. But you may find as you interact in your day-to-day life with people that people have a lot of prejudice that might shock you. And one of the important things to understand is that everybody has a different view on the world and a different view of how people, animals, and things interact with each other in the world. For instance, for me, it's shocking when some people don't like dogs, especially if they've never had an interaction with a dog before. But it's a part of life that people are going to have different feelings and thoughts than you will. Certain prejudice, like racism, we know is bad. But there's certain prejudice that in today's day and age is completely accepted. I mean, think about how many videos you see on YouTube where men are complaining about how all women are, or women are complaining about how all men are, right? This is just a new form of accepted social prejudice. And if we're going to be people who think outside of what the general norms are at the time, which a great storyteller will have to, well, we'll see these prejudices for what they are, which is, well, prejudice rather than rational thought. Okay, moving on from the explanation of that term. The second one is framing. Imagine you're looking through a window frame. You can only see really what's pictured within the window frame. You can't see what's beyond it. When we talk about framing as far as an author goes or a filmmaker, we're just talking about what the author or filmmaker chooses to show you. There might be more stuff going on behind the scenes, but you only get to see what's in the frame. What you see in the frame will influence your view on the story that's taking place, even if you don't know everything that's happening beyond the frame. All right, prejudice and framing. These are the two pillars of perspective that we'll be talking about today. Later on in the video, we'll be discussing an Edith Wharton story, one of her absolute masterpieces, a story of jealousy and revenge and betrayal and adultery. But we'll get to that once we really break down how to understand perspective. To become masters of understanding perspective, let's first dive into the loose dog proof. If you haven't heard this one yet, it's the easiest and best way to both explain and understand how to use perspective in storytelling. All right, so take a look at this. So what I want you to do as you look at the dog in this video is just consider the dog, consider the setting, and consider what you think. So just take a couple moments, watch it through. I'll play it again. So what is it you think as you're watching here? Now, odds are if you're a person who really likes dogs, well, you might be saying to yourself, oh, wow, you know, what a good-looking dog. Yeah, he looks so happy. He looks friendly. It's great that he's got so much land that he can run around on. It's all amazing, right? But if you're a person who is not that familiar with dogs or you don't like dogs that much, you might be saying to yourself, oh, I wonder if his recall is good. How has he gotten away? Is he missing? Is he dangerous? What if he comes over to me? What if there's no owner to recall him? The point is that as you're watching this video, you're going to have a very different impression and a very different feeling as to what's going on, depending on, well, your own perspective on dogs. Specifically, your own prejudice, either for or against dogs. But let's add step number 2 to really beef this example up. Say, as you're watching this video, that I tell you that this dog is the famous Butch who was deployed overseas to sniff out bombs in civilian areas where once there were bombs and landmines laid out. And because of his hard work and dedication, now all the civilians in this area can wander around the fields freely and they can plant their crops and they can have a good old life. Okay. So now there's another layer added to this animal, and regardless of how you feel about dogs, even if you did hold a negative view of dogs in general, now you're probably thinking more positive feelings about this animal. But wait, I made a mistake. This isn't actually Butch, the famous bomb-sniffing dog. This is actually Butch the Biter, and he's known for roaming loose off leash and getting away from his owners, and he bites everybody that he comes across. And you really better be aware if you come around him. So now you've got a very different view of who this dog is and what this dog being loose actually represents. And even if you're a person who does love dogs and a person who is pro off leash, well, hearing that this is an animal that bites, now you're a lot more wary. The entire scene has completely changed for you because of your perspective based on this information that you've learned. So these 2 pillars are going to be prejudice and, of course, framing. Prejudice and framing are the 2 most important aspects, or at least the most used aspects of storytellers in order to get their audience on board with the story. Just so you know, all that stuff I just made up. This is my mom's dog, Eeyore. He's a very good boy, and he likes to run around in the park. He's got great recall. No need to worry about him. Back into perspective. One of the most important things to know about perspective is that everybody has a different perspective. There are certain things you can learn about somebody where you might be able to better predict their perspective. And of course, as a storyteller, you need to become a master at understanding the perspectives of other people. That's the best way to tell an effective story. In this video, we're going to be discussing an Edith Wharton story, and she's one of the real masters of perspective. One of the reasons why I love this story so much is that she perfectly uses point of view, framing, and of course, prejudice, both in her characters and for the audience who is reading the story. And because of these tactics, Edith Wharton is able to implement not just a single twist, but a perfectly done, perfectly executed double twist. The story we're diving into is Roman Fever. Before we get into it, thank you so much to the almost 700 of you who have already subscribed this month. Remember, if you haven't yet, subscribing is the best way to help a small channel like mine. Otherwise, please like and leave a comment. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this audience. All right, let's not waste any more time and dive right into it. We'll start with a very basic rundown of how the story operates, and then we'll talk about how the double twist is so effective. We start the story by looking through Mrs. Slade's perspective, and we pretty much keep her point of view throughout the entire story, aside from a couple of minor shifts. So keep in mind that because we have Mrs. Slade's point of view throughout most of the story, we tend to identify more with her than we do with the other central character or with other characters in the story. The second central character in the story is Mrs. Ansley. Mrs. Ansley is one of Mrs. Slade's best friends. As it turns out, about 20 years ago, they were both in love with the same man. Things came to a head, things ended with the man and Mrs. Ansley, and the man ends up with Mrs. Slade. So now we're 20 years in the future from that moment of jealousy and of fighting over love. So 20 years later, the two women are in Italy and they're hanging out and they're reminiscing about old times. However, there's something that Mrs. Slade has never been able to get past with Mrs. Ansley, and it's starting to really eat her up inside. And so throughout the course of the story, Mrs. Slade is debating whether or not to talk to Mrs. Ansley about something from the past, and eventually she explodes and blurts it out. Mrs. Slade, way back in the day when she was fighting for this man, once penned a letter by the man to Mrs. Ansley in order to draw her out of her apartment during a dangerous time of year and to get her sick. As it turns out, Mrs. Ansley did get sick and she almost died, and so Mrs. Slade had a free path to woo this man and eventually won his favor. So 20 years ago, Mrs. Slade, the character that we follow through her perspective, well, she took out one of her best friends in order to win this man, and she finally admits it after 20 years. Keep in mind, these women have maintained a friendship and they've been, talking to each other, visiting with each other. They know each other extremely well. Their daughters are best friends. So it's a big emotional moment in which Mrs. Slade can finally confess and talk about how bad she feels, but at the same time, she doesn't feel too bad because she ended up with the man, right? Okay, massive spoilers ahead if you haven't read the story yet. It's about a 10-minute read. You can find it for free online. Here we go. As it turns out, Mrs. Ansley has a secret of her own. See, she responded to the letter sent by Mrs. Slade thinking it was sent by the man. And as it turns out, the man did want to see Mrs. Ansley. And so they did end up meeting that night. And they had relations. And so Mrs. Slade, it turns out, accidentally hooked up the man that she really likes with her best friend, the very thing that she was terrified of doing to begin with. And at the very end of the story, Mrs. Ansley confides that her daughter actually belongs to Mrs. Slade's now deceased husband. All right, so big double twist. First twist is that Mrs. Slade tried to get her friend essentially killed way back in the day out of jealousy. The second twist is that desperate move ended up hooking up her best friend with the man she was trying to keep her away from. So why does this twist work so well? Well, let's think about it from a matter of perspective. Mrs. Slade, the character that we follow, believes that she is smarter than everybody else. She's always pulling the strings and manipulating things behind the scenes. She has a very high opinion of herself. And because she's the only person in the story that the audience identifies with, well, we kind of take her for her word. We believe that she's probably right about the way that she sees the world. However, one of the big misses that Mrs. Slade has is in misidentifying her own best friend. She thinks Mrs. Ansley is simple and that she lost out on this man that they both liked so long ago, and that Mrs. Ansley is sort of like a side character in the story. As it really turns out, Mrs. Ansley knows a lot more than she lets on and has some secrets of her own. Not only that, but she's pulled a lot of strings behind the scenes herself. Mrs. Slade is not completely in control of the situation. That's one of the biggest things that Mrs. Ansley teaches her, and in doing so, teaches the audience. As the audience, we feel like Mrs. Slade is the one in control. As it turns out, she's not 2 times over. So that's what gives us the double twist. The twist is given to Mrs. Slade, and through Mrs. Slade, it's given to us. So the two things Edith Wharton manipulates here are prejudice and perspective. Mrs. Slade has certain prejudice against Mrs. Ansley because of jealousy and because of how well she knows her. And the audience adopts those prejudices because we're following the story through her point of view. The second thing is the frame of the story. We don't know anything about Mrs. Ansley. We don't know that she has any secrets of her own. The frame of the story that Edith Wharton gives us is Mrs. Slade's perspective on the issue. By the time we learn that Mrs. Ansley has a very different view of things and has a very different view of Mrs. Slade, well, we're far enough in the story where it gives us a big punch. All right, everybody, remember, you are a storyteller too, so as you go about your day-to-day life, whether you're a writer or somebody who likes to talk, like many of us do, well, I hope that these tactics can be helpful regardless of who it is you're talking to or the kind of story that you want to tell. Remember, the best way to help out a small channel like mine is to subscribe. If you already have, please like, leave a comment. We're going to continue to make videos about the classics, classic authors, and all sorts of things related to books and storytelling. Everybody remember to drink enough water and get enough sleep, and I'll see you next time. Take care.